welcome everybody to my channel. And we have today Christine Niles, who's an investigative reporter with Church Militant, and she's joining us today to answer some questions, and we're really excited to have her. So please welcome Christine, and we'd love to hear a little bit about Christine's background. And she has a wonderful conversion story. She does like a series of videos, right? Aren't those called Forward Boldly? It's like a whole series on Church Militant. And I really recommend you guys check that out. Her conversion story is beautiful, and her whole, backstory, because originally you're from Vietnam, right, Christine?
Right. Yeah.
Wow. So a whole journey to get you here.
It was. And thank you so much for inviting me onto your show. I'm very happy to be here. Yes, let's see. Yeah, I do. If you want kind of the long version of my story, you can go watch the Forward Boldly episode for those viewers out there. It's just called My Story. But the short version is I was born in Saigon in 1974, Saigon, Vietnam. And a year later, the communists swept through in April 1975 and essentially took control of all of Vietnam. And they came to my family and they took everything that we had. I don't have much of a memory of Vietnam because I left when I was young, but from what my parents told me, we were a wealthy family. My mother had, her mother owned a jewelry store, so she came from wealth. And then my father he did not come from wealth at all. He came from absolute poverty, but through a lot of hard work, and he won scholarships and things like that. He became a very well-respected structural engineer in Vietnam and built a number of the buildings and bridges there. Wow. And he was also a chairman of a bank. And so we were a well-to-do family. Each of us 3 children had our own nannies, that sort of thing. Communists come in, took everything that my family had. And at that time, there was a mass exodus of Vietnamese out of Saigon, as well as a number of people leaving the country as boat people and refugees. And my dad made the really difficult decision in 1976 to leave the country because he knew that our family just had no future in Vietnam. And this was a really hard decision for him because that was all that he knew. That was his homeland. I mean, he still loves Vietnam and still tries to visit when he can. But he knew with the communists there's nothing, that we just didn't have a future. And so we were very blessed because the children, me and my siblings, all had French citizenship because my grandfather was from France. He was stationed as a colonel back when Vietnam was known as Indochina, because Vietnam was under French occupation for many years. And that was actually part of the genesis of the Vietnam Wars, because the Vietnamese under Ho Chi Minh, who was trained as a communist in the Soviet Union, he came back and he wanted to essentially, throw off the so-called shackles of French oppression. That's kind of how the whole war started. So my grandfather, he was a French colonel. His French citizenship passed down through my mother to each of us 3 children. And that was essentially our ticket to freedom. We were able to get on a plane and go to France. We didn't have to go through all the horrible trials of, the boat people and refugees, which a number of my relatives were. And I heard their horror stories. We sponsored a few of them to come to the United States. But we went to France for a few years. And that was a rough life from what my parents told me, because here we are coming from wealth to my father driving taxis, in the streets just to support his family. And he had a friend who recommended to him after a couple of years of this, why don't you try America, land of opportunity. Maybe you could make a new life there and do better over there. And so my dad thought about it, and he again made the very courageous and difficult decision just to pack up with his wife and 3 very, very young children and go to America. And his English was really bad. I mean, he had such a thick accent that nobody could understand him. And he wasn't fluent in it the way that he was in French, because when you're in Vietnam, you study French. Everybody knows how to speak French. And so he didn't have a problem in France communicating, but coming to America, he had a very difficult problem communicating. But through the kindness of an employer named Mike Ambrose, interestingly, he was an atheist, but he gave my father a chance. He owned his own engineering firm, and he allowed my father to kind of learn. He trained him up, even though my dad said for the first 6 months he was useless. He couldn't do anything. And yet this man continued to pay him, give him a job, salary, teach him and train him until my father was competent enough to go off and establish his own engineering firm. And so thanks be to God, God brought us through some very difficult times, but my father was able to grow his business, put all 3 of us through college. And now we have our own careers, and, thanks be to God for all of that. I just see God's grace in everything.
Oh yeah, that's awesome. And then you went on to Notre Dame and Oxford. I mean, you've studied a lot.
Yes. Well, when I was in undergrad, my dream was to study at Oxford. I loved reading J.R.R. Tolkien. I loved C.S. Lewis. I knew that they were professors there. And, I had this, it was very romantic to me, like the dreaming spires of Oxford. I wanted to go to Oxford. And I was also a very intellectually curious individual. I majored in philosophy, but I loved theology. This was actually after I had sort of fallen away from the Catholic faith. And that's kind of a story in and of itself, which people, again, you can watch my story and learn all about that. But so I first tried doing an exchange program in Oxford for a year. And that was a wonderful experience. I studied at the Center for Medieval and Renaissance Studies. I was still Protestant at the time, but that was my first exposure to Catholicism in the sense that I started studying early church history. And I actually watched a film, A Man for All Seasons, which, as we know, it's about St. Thomas More, an incredible saint. It was my first exposure to a Catholic saint and martyr. I'd never been exposed to that in my entire life. And I was so inspired, even though I was a Protestant at the time, I was so inspired by the witness of St. Thomas More and his courage and willingness to die for the sake of his faith. And I thought, wow, do I have that sort of courage to do that? Wow. So that kind of got the wheels turning about kind of the Catholic faith. And that was kind of the first draw for me. I mean, I would eventually come back at Notre Dame Law School, which I got a degree at Oxford, in a master's degree in theology. And then I came back to Indiana, and I got a law degree from Notre Dame Law School. And that's actually where I came back to the faith, believe it or not. So for those out there who are despairing about the state of, University of Notre Dame, yeah, there are a lot of bad things happening there. Unfortunately, I think they're having a abortion panel. They're calling a reproductive rights or reproductive freedom panel at Notre Dame, which is absolutely horrible. Wow. But there are pockets of the faith there, and that's where I came back to the faith. It was in my third year at Notre Dame Law School.
Wow. So you were going to be a lawyer?
Yeah. I mean, I am a licensed attorney, and I did work on the Indiana Supreme Court for one of the Supreme Court justices there for a couple of years as his judicial law clerk. And so there were a lot of very important cases that came to the Supreme Court at that time, including probably the biggest abortion case ever to come to Indiana. What's interesting, because that was actually the very last case that I ended my, my clerkship on. It was like the biggest abortion case ever to come to Indiana. And that was massive. And I was tasked with writing the opinion for my justice and doing the research on all of that. And so I prayed and prayed and prayed about that case. And I put something together based on the legal precedent that I found. And we submitted that as his sort of opinion. I don't know if your viewers understand how it works behind the scenes in state Supreme Courts. It also works this way in the U.S. Supreme Court. But justices will offer their own kind of opinions, their written opinions on, how they want to decide the case. And they circulate the opinion among all the other justices, and the other justices vote. So they either decide to join in their opinion, or they decide, no, I'm not going to join that opinion. I'm going to join this opinion instead because I disagree, or I'm going to write a dissent. And so this circulates for months until you finally get some sort of consensus about what's the majority, what's in the minority.
Wow.
And there was a huge discussion behind the scenes over this abortion case, because it was massive. Everybody understood. And we were very blessed. I guess it was providential, because in that year, you had a couple of the justices who were up for re-election. And because in the state Supreme Courts, some of the justices are actually voted for. That's not what happens on the U.S. Supreme Court. On the state courts, some of them are reelected. And so some of these justices they didn't want a hot button issue like abortion to cloud the election. So even though they were personally pro-abortion, they didn't want to sign their names because they thought, this is going to cause all sorts of flack publicly, and I might not get reelected. So at the end of the day, when you had all these different opinions circulating, like, let's enshrine abortion in the Indiana Constitution, then like, no, we cannot do that. We're not going to repeat Roe v. Wade on the Indiana state level. We had my justice's opinion, which was kind of like in the middle, sort of like neutral, and just basically said, no, we're going to dismiss the case and not deal with it. That was the opinion that ended up ruling the day. And so I kind of went out with a bang. I was very proud of that.
Oh my gosh.
I mean, it would have been ideal if we got the, totally pro-life opinion adopted, but with the makeup of the court, though, it was impossible. And so we got the next best thing, which was my justice's decision to let's just not even deal with this because there's this legal whatever technicality. And so thanks be to God, we do not have abortion enshrined in the Indiana state constitution.
Oh, wow. That's quite the story. Man, so you went out from that. Did you go directly to work for Church Militant?
I did not. I spent, so I had my first child in my last year on the Indiana Supreme Court. And when I had my first child, that changed everything. I was like, okay, because my original plan was to go work at a law firm. And the thing is, if you're going to go work at a law firm, you're looking at 60 to 80-hour weeks. That's just how it is, in the law firm world. And I thought, there is no way I'm going to do that and leave my children at home. There is no way I'm doing that. So I decided I want to be a stay-at-home mom. I want to raise my children. That's what I want to do. I don't want to go do, get this career, whatever. I could, but I'm not going to do that. And so after I ended my term on the Indiana State Supreme Court, I just became a stay-at-home mom. And I started teaching law classes online through one of the distance universities. So that was a good supplement to my income. I was doing freelance copy editing. And so I did that for a few years. But I wanted something a bit more substantial and long-term. And so I started praying novenas to St. Joseph for employment. And he came through because the Church Militant job, it just landed on my lap. I was looking for it. I wasn't trying to get it. It just landed on my lap. It's kind of a long story, but just to sum up, I got to know some of the staff behind the scenes of Church Militant because I started following the Vortex, the daily video that Michael Vorse puts out. And so I was corresponding, emailing some of the people behind the scenes, and Michael Vorse learned about my academic background. And so he paid me for a small freelance project of just reviewing Bishop Barron's Catholicism series. Are you familiar with that? 10-part video series? Yeah. So he just wanted me to kind of review it. And so I did. I put together this 20-page review of chapter by chapter by chapter of the strengths of it as opposed to the weaknesses. And it was footnoted. I mean, it looked like an academic, research paper, which isn't what he was expecting. And so I think he told me later on that he was really impressed by that paper and the academic stuff, all of that. And so that's what spurred him on to sort of invite me to come visit the studio. And so I came and visited in June of 2014 for 3 days. And by the end of the visit, he offered me a full-time position. So, yeah, that's how I ended up here.
Oh my gosh. Wow. How many years has it been that you've been?
So that was 2014. It's now 2023. So 9 years.
Oh, awesome.
9 years now. Yeah.
What would you say are some of the most valuable things that you've learned while working there?
Gosh, so many things. The first I would say is that prayer and personal holiness have to underlie everything that we do, because our work is not effective without the prayer and the personal holiness coming first. So that's what we place a premium on every day at the studio. We do our morning prayer, and then we have the midday prayer, and then we have our evening prayer. And we do that every single day. Plus we pray the rosary together. That's mandatory. In fact, it's mandatory to pray the rosary every day. You can't work at Church Militant and not pray the rosary every day because Michael understands that it's absolutely powerful. Sorry about that.
Oh, you're good.
He understands it's absolutely powerful. And our apostolate is actually consecrated to both Our Lady and St. Michael. So they're the patrons of our apostolate. So we turn to them constantly. So that's the first thing is, just understanding that my work cannot be effective without the prayer and the personal holiness. That's number one. I'd say another thing that I learned too is just the value of chasing down a story, being proactive and persevering. The good journalists are very proactive. They persevere. They don't give up. If someone doesn't want to talk to you, a source or whatever, you don't just say, oh well, and move on. I mean, you just keep pursuing the story. You find somebody else who's willing to talk. You're dogged, in your pursuit of a story. And, working with victims as well has been very valuable, very eye-opening. You learn the extent of the trauma that victims suffer through clerical abuse or through people who refuse to believe them, who try to dismiss them. Those are some of the most valuable things I've learned working at Church Militant.
That's awesome. Thank you for that. I mean, what a great reflection just on any job, state in life. I mean, it's so true. How are you going to be effective and really do God's work without making yourself so dedicated to him? That's great.
Right. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering, I mean, the work you do is often, I feel like, underappreciated and criticized even. Like people think you do it because it's fun or you just want to smear people or whatever. It's like, no. I wanted just to ask if you can shed some light on why it's important, like why you cover the things that you do and why you need to get it out there. Like you guys feel called to do that. And I think it's serving a real need.
Sure. When I first started at Church Militant, I didn't immediately do investigative reporting. I just did general news. And well, what's really funny is because I wasn't even supposed to be on TV, really. My understanding coming to Church Militant was I was basically going to be sitting behind a computer screen doing research and writing because that has always been my strength. My background is academic. I am good at research. I'm good at writing. And so that's what I thought I was going to be doing. And then just through a complete fluke, I ended up doing headlines, which is the daily short little newscast. And I did that for about, I did that for like 8 years. But it was a total fluke. I wasn't supposed to do it. It just happened that the lady who fronted that show went off and got married. And then the other guy who also fronted it, he joined a monastery. And then the fill-in went to London. And so Boris walks up to me one day, and I had just started working there. Maybe 1 month, I don't know, 2. And he walks up to me one day. He's like, "You're on in 5 minutes." I'm just like, what?
No.
What are you talking about? And what's really funny is I was finding excuses for not to be on camera. And the night before, my then 2-year-old daughter, Anna, I was behind her, like pulling up one of these pull-up diapers.
Oh, yeah.
And she, like moved her head back like that, right into my chin. And it hit me so hard. I saw stars. I've never had my face hit so hard in my life. I mean, I almost blacked out. That's how hard she hit me. And the next day I had a huge purple bruise right here. I mean, it was purple, literally purple, huge. And so I'm pointing at this and like, Michael, I'm not going on air with this on my face. I can't do it. And he's just like, "Oh, just cover it with makeup. It's fine."
Oh,
and I do my first headlines, and I'm horribly nervous. People don't realize this. They assume that my background is media. They just assume, like, when I came to Church Militant, I had all sorts of media experience. I had 0 media experience, and I was terrified of being on camera. My heart was pounding out of my chest. But my motto was "fake it till you make it."
Oh,
so
good.
Just pretend you're confident until you actually acquire confidence. And so that was my motto for years. I can't even tell you. I mean, even though I had to go on headlines every single day, my heart was pounding every day. I was praying prayers to my guardian angel. People never believe me when I tell them that because they think, "Oh, you're so natural." I'm like, yeah, I faked it for a long time. I was good at faking it. But obviously I'm comfortable now, but I've been here for 9 years, for crying out loud. I've been every single day for 9 years. You would think, after a while you become comfortable. But it was not something I was, jumping to do at all. But it just ended up that way. So, they say God writes straight with crooked lines. He chooses like the least, I don't know, obvious choice to accomplish his will. And that would have been me. Because if someone told me 10 years ago, "Oh, Christine, you're going to be fronting all these investigations and doing all this stuff. You're going to have your own show and all that stuff," I would have laughed in their faces. I would have been like, "You're confusing me with somebody else. That's not, no." But okay, great. So to go back to answer your question about the investigations. I started out doing news. I was doing headlines. I was writing stories. I was copying all that stuff. But Michael saw that I had this ability to really chase things down and kind of get very granular and follow up with stories and get in touch with various individuals and expose things. He saw that I had a strength in that investigative aspect. Plus, I have this background in law, as well as all the other things that I could draw on to help with my investigations, and they're very useful now. And so he eventually created what we call the Special Projects Department, and Special Projects specializes in investigative reporting. And so he kind of put me as the head of that department a few years ago. And that's when I really started doing the actual investigative documentaries that I put out now, like Spotlight, which we just aired last night. Did McCarrick Make a Murder? We just aired that one last night. And so it's not, anybody who thinks I'm doing this for fun is out of their minds, because I get so much vicious backlash. You have seen it. Some people actually hate me.
Please pause it.
And you're good. Hang on, I'm so sorry.
Totally fine. I have children too. And it's so crucial to do this. It's absolutely not scandalmongering. Some people think that too. Oh, you just want to spread scandal and rumor monger. No, absolutely not.
Right.
We love the church. We desire to see the church reformed and purified and purged of the filth. And you can't do that unless you first expose the filth. Sunlight is the best disinfectant.
Oh,
and
that's good.
we've seen, results. We've seen real world results from some of the media exposure that there are stories now that we're covering, like for instance, SSPX, that nobody else in the Catholic world is willing to touch. But someone's got to do it. Someone's got to do it. Someone's got to take the backlash for it and all the hatred and all that stuff. Because believe me, we take it. But for the sake of the victims and for the sake of the church that we love, for Holy Mother Church, it's got to be done.
Right. No, that's great, because I've really thought that too. It's like those are sordid stories, things that are really hard to even talk about. Most people are just uncomfortable with, so of course they don't want to jump in there if they don't have to. But you guys do that, and it's like it's needed, even though it doesn't make you necessarily popular, but it's a niche that needs to be filled. And I feel like you guys are really brave to be stepping up and doing that. Speaking
and
out.
I wish my colleagues in the Catholic media would step up and do this, because people ask us, they're like, okay, so why do you go after the SSPX? Well, the first thing I say is I go after anyone. I mean, I don't care who you are. I don't care if you're in the Novus Ordo Church or if you're trad. If you're abusing children, if you're abusing vulnerable adults, you're going to be exposed. If you're covering it up, you're going to be exposed. I don't care who you are. I don't care if you wear a rainbow stole or fiddleback chasuble. I don't care. And the problem is there are too many people in Catholic media today who do care. They align themselves with a particular tribe, and because it's their tribe, they refuse to expose it. And I'm not going to name any names because these people know who they are, and I've called them out for it before, but it's sheer hypocrisy. It's sheer hypocrisy. It's like you've got the trad group, and I go to the traditional Latin Mass. This is not attacking traditionalism, but I've just seen it too much in the whole traditionalist world, where they're more than happy to trash and go after the Novus Ordo bishops and the clergy because they're doing sex abuse and covering it up, and yet they will be completely silent about the stuff going on in their own ranks.
Oh,
it drives me absolutely nuts. It's hypocritical. It's a double standard.
Right. Because we should all have the same, things, basic goals in mind, and wanting to protect people and be in the service of the truth. And if you're covering that up, and it's like, well, then you have another motive, but it needs to be brought to the light then.
Absolutely. And as far as I'm concerned, if you have a public platform and you are refusing to call out the abuse and cover up going on in some of these trad communities, because it's not just the SSPX, there are others as well. If you're like a big trad platform and you've got a big voice, and yet you refuse to use it to denounce the abuse and the cover up, then as far as I'm concerned, you are complicit. You're taking part in it. You're helping. You're enabling it. And unfortunately, that's going on, with some of my colleagues in the media, in the trad media, that's going on. But at Church Militant, we don't play favorites. You can't do that. And I say this all the time. You cannot place tribe over truth. Truth has to come first, always. And there have been stories of priests that I have exposed that it was painful for me to write the report or do the report, because I didn't want to, because it was maybe it was part of a community that I really liked. Like for instance, the FSSP. I went to many FSSP parishes. My children were baptized in the FSSP. I have friendships with FSSP priests. And so I didn't want to write a report on Father James Jackson and the child porn accusation. I didn't want to. It was painful for me. But you know what? You have to. If you're going to be a journalist with any sort of integrity, you have to. He wasn't the only one. There are other trad priests as well that I've written about, that with pain in my heart as I wrote it, because I realized, wow, this is someone that I knew, and yet here he's doing this. And I've got to write on it, because otherwise it's hypocritical for me not to.
Oh, that is really hard. I mean, does that ever make you feel bitter? I mean, have you been able to kind of deal with it well enough? So it's like, obviously you love the church and you're very devoted and you're doing this because you feel like you have to, but it's not, does it kind of spoil things for you or make you just kind of like jaded?
Yeah, people ask me that question. I've never become bitter or jaded towards the church. I know some people do become very bitter and jaded towards the church, and I certainly don't blame them if they're victims, especially. But I've never become bitter or jaded. And I think part of it is it does require a certain constitution to do the work that I do. just like it requires a certain sort of constitution to be like a surgeon, and cut people open, which I could never do, or be an EMT where you're on the scene at horrific accidents and you're helping people and they're, who are bleeding on the street. I could never do that. But some people can do that. They just have the constitution to be able to do that. And I have the constitution to be able to dive deep into these investigations, look at some very sordid, horrible things, and still be able to deal with it without getting jaded or bitter. Part of that too is just you have to have a deep prayer life. You have to have a close relationship with God, and you have to keep your focus on the long view, on the eternal truths and why you're doing this. It's ultimately to help purify the church. And maybe it's the case that you're not even going to see the results in your lifetime. It could be that maybe in the next lifetime, you'll see some results, but you're trying to move the ball down the field a little bit. And I don't let it really discourage me. Now, sometimes I can feel like we're facing this tsunami of evil, and how do we stand against it? Because it does seem like there's this huge tidal wave of evil, like just from the world. The world feels like all hell is breaking loose. And it kind of feels that way in the church sometimes as well. But I always remind myself, this got to focus on Christ alone. Can't place my faith in any man. I don't care who it is or how, devout or pious the particular cleric is. You can't place your faith in the Pope. You place your faith in Christ alone and trust his promise when he says, he established his church on this rock. I shall build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. That's Christ's promise, and Christ doesn't lie. And so his church will never be overrun, ever. Even if that means he has to preserve a little remnant, I just make sure I'm part of that remnant. So yeah, just to answer your question, no, I don't allow myself to get discouraged. I've got a very fighting spirit. I've always had that. And I have a strong thirst for justice. And so you have to have that. And it's because that's really what spurs you on continually.
Absolutely. Yeah. All this stuff is so heavy, and you don't want to get bogged down, but also, you got to keep your faith, and you're not leaving the church like other people. They're scandalized, they're upset, and they just leave. But it's like, well, there's always something else going on there. What their faith was based on wasn't, the solid rock of Jesus, like you're saying.
Christ alone. It always has to be Christ alone. I think, again, I certainly do not judge victims. Okay. Because if I were abused by a priest, oh gosh, it would take supernatural grace for me, I think, to remain in the church, because every time I saw a man in a collar, how could I not associate that with my abuse? It would be so difficult for me, I think, especially for those who were really horribly abused by a priest, someone that they trusted. And especially if it went on for a long time, I would think it would be incredibly difficult just to walk into any church at all and just see that collar. So I certainly don't judge some of these victims. And I've worked with a number of victims who were traumatized by things that happened in the church and then ended up leaving. And I pray for them. I pray that one day they'll come back to the faith, but I certainly don't stand in judgment over them as if I'm so much better. I mean, it's by the grace of God, that we remain in the church. And certainly, God willing, I will stay Catholic till the day that I die. Why would I leave? Because that's like harming myself. It's like cutting off my nose to spite my face. I mean, it's the Holy Mother Church, which gives us the life-giving sacraments. So why would I cut myself off from that? That would be harming myself. The answer here is draw closer to Christ. Let it draw you close to Christ. Cling to Christ alone. Don't look to any man. I don't care how holy he appears in the church. You go to Christ. Go to his Blessed Mother, the saints. And one thing I always try to tell people who are very discouraged by the state of the church or discouraged by looking at the Pope or anything like that, I just remind them popes come and go, clergy come and go, but the church always remains.
Oh, that's so good. Absolutely. No, it's that perspective. If you don't have perspective, then you'll get kind of swallowed up in all the crazy. But I mean, this work has brought you under personal attack and even threats, right? I mean, you don't get, benefits from it really, other than spiritual, right?
The benefits that I get are from the victims and their families. Those mean more to me than anything, because a number of times after I air these reports, I will get notes of gratitude, sometimes tearful messages from either the victims or their families saying, thank you so much for doing this. You're the first person who has listened. You are the first one to give us a voice and a platform. Thank you so much. And a lot of them find healing in that. And so for me, when I get a single note like that, it makes up for everything. It makes up for all the backlash and all the attacks and everything, just getting a single note, knowing that I've helped a victim or their family. That's all that matters as far as I'm concerned. And also helping to clean up the church as well. So absolutely, I've gotten vicious backlash for the work that I do. But what's ironic is I've got this long track record of exposing corruption in the church. And most of it, before 2020 was focusing on clergy, clerical corruption, cover up in what I guess they call the Novus Ordo Church, the wider church. And I started turning, as you know, my sights onto the Society of St. Pius X in 2020. I aired my very first spotlight on that after speaking to a number of different victims. And I didn't go after them any harder than I went after the other bishops and clergy that I, exposed in the rest of the church. But the backlash that I got for that was amazing. I mean, it was the most vicious backlash I've ever gotten for anything that I've done. And this is not me like saying, oh, poor me. Not at all. It's just more an objective kind of comparison.
No, other people noticed it too. I mean, you were on, was it Jeff Gordon's show talking about that after one of the big
Tim Gordon.
Mm-hmm. Tim Gordon. Yeah. Yes. Thank you. Yeah. I remember watching that and just being like, wow, you guys, like, this is terrible.
Yes. I can't even repeat the names that they called me. I mean, and then I was being sent these videos. And I was just really, I was stunned. I was really stunned. But I thought, wow, if they think that this sort of backlash is going to make me back down somehow, they've got another thing coming, because that's not who I am. That's not how I am at all. So it made me even more determined, because I thought, okay, there's this backlash, meaning there's massive resistance to any sort of admission that this abuse goes on in the SSPX. And I started getting contacted by victims all over the world, not just here, but all over the world. And I started realizing, wow, this is bigger and deeper and broader than I ever knew. And so I started rolling out a series of reports on the SSPX, along with the other reports that I was already doing on the rest of the church. So I don't want people to think that I've just got this hyper focus only on the SSPX. If you look at my investigations, you'll see that most of the work I've done actually has focused on other parts of the church, not the SSPX at all. It actually comprises a minority of what I do. Yeah. But yeah, it was amazing, the backlash, but it has to be done. It has to be done. And the victims, like I said, are so grateful. I can't tell you the number of notes of gratitude I've received from victims who've said, thank you so much, because nobody else will believe us and nobody else will give us a voice. Only you will.
Oh my gosh. Wow. Well, thank God for you. I'm just so grateful that can be there for them, because yeah, it's, you got to do it. And then you mentioned that in other traditionalist groups, there are really similar problems. So you've seen this kind of stuff come out, not just about the SSPX, but other ones even within the church, right?
Yes. And I think the reason that, yeah, I want to get into that, other traditionalist communities as well. But I think one of the reasons that there was so much resistance to initially believing that the SSPX could be guilty of not just abuse, but also cover up at the highest levels is because they set themselves forth as very pious, as very orthodox and faithful to the magisterium. They offer the traditional Latin Mass. And so automatically there's this veneer of fidelity. And you just assume that the priest can kind of do no wrong. Because, oh, look, they're offering the Latin Mass and they're so holy. I mean, I hear that all the time. Oh, holy priest. And it's like, why do you think he's holy? Just because he offers the traditional Latin Mass? There's nothing there that automatically makes you holy just because you offer the traditional Latin Mass. But for whatever reason, the laity seem to have this idea that, oh, you offer the TLM and, oh, it makes you just holy and better than the others. Not that Novus Ordo stuff. It's like, no, I'm sorry, that is not the case at all. And the more I look into the abuse cases, because I haven't reported everything that I know, what I've reported is the tip of the iceberg. There are lots of other stories that I have not reported, either because I'm still compiling the evidence or because I can't get like independent corroboration. Not that I don't believe the victims. So The more I look at it, the more I see that, wow, the rate of abuse and cover up is at least on the same level in the Novus Ordo as well as the trad circles. It's at least on the same level. It's not like the way people want to present it is, oh, well, it's so much worse over here. And sure, we have a few bad apples here, but it's nowhere near as bad as over here. That's just not the case. And something else I need to bring out as well, for those SSPX loyalists who are still thinking that, oh, it's just a few bad apples. It's not just a few bad apples, because the corruption goes way up to the top. Bishop Bernard Fillet, as I exposed in a number of spotlights, was absolutely complicit in transferring and shuffling around predator priests who went on to abuse more victims in case after case after case, or hiding predators away and then reinstating them to ministry somewhere else. I mean, he was no better in the way that he dealt with stuff than Cardinal Law, Cardinal Mahoney in LA, or any of the bad ones that we can think of. He was just as bad. And I'm so tired of these SSPX loyalists simply saying, oh, it's just a few bad apples. And no, it went straight to the top to this day, because Father Paul Urani is also guilty of doing things like that.
Wow. Gosh.
Yeah. But sorry, to get back to your question about other communities. Like I mentioned, the FSSP, Father James Jackson, I was floored by the reaction to my reporting on Father James Jackson. People absolutely attacked me. And for those out there who are not familiar with the story, Father James Jackson was actually rector of Our Lady of Guadalupe Seminary, the FSSP seminary in Denton, Nebraska, for many years. A highly respected individual. I believe he's published books. He's considered an expert on the liturgy. He appeared in Mass of the Ages, that documentary. And so he's a very highly respected individual. And suddenly he's arrested for allegations of child porn. And there was a raid on his rectory, and they found child porn on his computer as well as on an external hard drive that was right outside his bedroom in the rectory office, which I have since learned does not have open access to the rest of the house. This is an office that you can actually only enter through his bedroom, and his bedroom is normally locked. And so, but then all these theories started flowing around. Oh, he must have been framed by the feds. He was framed. And I wouldn't buy into those theories, because I thought, you don't have a lick of evidence to show that he was framed. You don't have a lick of evidence to prove that he was hacked. You have nothing to go on. The only reason you're saying that he's framed is because he's a TLM priest who's respected. And so you're looking for any explanation, just to excuse this person. And I was unwilling to do that, because I live in reality, quite frankly. And they attacked me for that, because I wouldn't buy into their conspiracy theories. And I'm like, give me the evidence, and nobody could give me any evidence.
Oh, wow.
And so they viciously attacked me over that. I thought, wow, you seem to have the same cult-like loyalty in the FSSP as you do in the SSPX to these priests. It's like a clericalism. You think these priests can do no wrong. They offer the TLM. They talk about the liturgy. They're so respected and knowledgeable. Oh, there's no way that they could do this other stuff. And I'm just like, wow, there's so much blindness, so much naivete.
Gosh.
But but I'm sorry to say this too. Evidence in the Institute of Christ the King as well, ICK. Something I have not yet reported on. But, all I can only tell people who love the traditional Latin Mass, don't place your faith in any community or in any priest, okay? There is no safe haven in this world. That's why I keep telling people Christ alone. Focus on Christ alone. By all means, go to the TLM, receive our Lord there, worship him there. But don't assume that your community is some safe haven that's better and safer than the rest of the church. I hate to say this, there's no real safe haven as long as we're in this world. As St. Therese of Lisieux said, the world's thy ship and not thy home. People need to understand that. We're just passing through here. And our eternal destiny is with Christ. And he's really the only one that you should be clinging to and looking to as the perfect. He's your safe haven. That's the one. So
great. No, that's really a good point. Absolutely. No, I appreciate that. And it's really important to talk about this too, because a lot of my viewers are trads or recovering trads who've kind of been hurt by it in different ways and come out of it. And so there's a lot of effort on YouTube being put out about doctrinal issues and things with the SSPX instead of acquaintism and those things, and which is great. But then there's all these other things that like some people kind of tune that stuff out, or they're just like, no, I've decided who I'm going to trust. I don't need to listen to you. But when things like this come out, like the moral issues that they've even, like the SSPX has claimed not to have in the past, but they point the finger at other people. And then it's like, well, actually you do have the same problem. So how are you going to account for that? That really wakes people up. So I feel like I really appreciate that you're willing to talk about it, because it's going to help save people from other issues and errors that they maybe can't recognize because they're just not at that place yet.
Right. I don't discuss the doctrinal issues so much. I kind of leave it to the experts who know a lot better than I do to discuss that. But some people who have done some fantastic discussions of this are Michael Lofton and John Salza. Now, I encourage people, if you really want to learn about the canonical status of the SSPX or some of the doctrinal errors that they make, go watch John Salza. Really, I mean, this is a man who was SSPX for many years. Many years he was SSPX. So he has an insider's view of someone who used to vigorously defend the SSPX, and now he's no longer in it. And his talks are fantastic. I mean, this is a man who knows what he's talking about. And I encourage people to go watch some of his talks, as well as Michael Lofton. He's very good as well. Michael Lofton was also, former SSPX. But yes, as you mentioned, the other side that I try to expose is the sex abuse and the corruption, because people they need to stop being so naive. Quite frankly, I say that in all charity. Stop being naive about your clergy. Stop approaching them like they're demigods. Stop approaching, because that sort of culture is fostered in the more traditional communities, is, like I said, a clericalism where you treat the priest as very special and you generally don't question the priest. If you do question the priest, usually you're shamed and blamed. You just have to treat them with utmost reverence and respect because they're very special, especially in the SSPX, which calls itself eternal Rome, right? Just very exalted and unique position. I've heard of people who were in the SSPX and no longer are, and they said what's really taught in the schools is outside the SSPX, there's no salvation. So for them, it's kind of like the last great hope on earth. And the priests who are chosen to be SSPX priests are very special. You don't question them. Well, that is the perfect breeding ground for abuse. That's the perfect breeding ground for cover up. And that's exactly what happens if you look at various cults and things. It's this, you never question the leader. You simply blindly obey. And that is encouraged in some of these traditional communities. And like I said, is the perfect breeding ground for abuse. And that's how a lot of it happens, why victims aren't believed. Instead, they're shunned, kicked out of the community. I've spoken to many victims who are shunned out of the SSPX because they spoke up.
Man.
And
Wow. So you mentioned the leadership and going all the way to the top, that the corruption has gone that far and that they cover to maintain this facade. I mean, so they're really not trustworthy, are they? I mean, and then it's not just Filet probably either. I don't know how much you know about the others, but yeah, it's you can't just point to one person and be like, oh, it's just him.
No, it's not. I mean, I encourage people to go and either watch or read. I've written many articles on this as well, on some of the cases exposing Bishop Bernard Filet. But Schmidberger was also complicit in the case of Father Philippe Peignot. Now, Father Philippe Peignot, for those of you who may be familiar with the case of Vincent Lambert in France, I don't know if you're familiar with that case, but he was the famous quadriplegic. And there was a huge debate in France over the end of life.
Oh, yeah.
Vincent Lambert was a quadriplegic. They called him in a persistent vegetative state, but he responded to his parents. He responded, he wasn't a vegetable. And yet, I believe it was his wife who wanted to just basically let him die, starve him to death. So there was this huge debate in France over the case of Vincent Lambert. Unfortunately, tragically, he was allowed to die. So the culture of death won in that case. But the genesis of Vincent Lambert's condition had to do with abuse that he suffered by Father Philippe Peignot, SSPX priest. Father Peignot admitted to abusing Lambert when Lambert was a child. Lambert then turned to drugs and alcohol, which almost always happens with abuse victims. They turn to drugs and alcohol to medicate the pain. And it was because he was drunk and riding on a motorcycle. he got into this huge crash and ended up being a quadriplegic. But you can pretty much lay the blame at the feet of Father Peñot, SSPX priest. He also abused a number of other boys in France. This was known to the leadership. Father Schmidberger knew. And for a little while, they placed some restrictions on him. He was made to go do like a year of prayer and penance at Lourdes. There's a SSPX house at Lourdes. But then he was put right back in a parish with free access to children. And guess what he did after that? He abused another child. And that's the one that I exposed in one of my spotlights. And then Bishop Flay comes into power. He knows all about the past, about Peñot and all of that. He also, a second time, lifts the ban on Peñot. And this is all documented. This is not rumor, conjecture. This is all documented. There's correspondence. There's an audio tape. There's like an audio tape of Father Nicholas Pfluger, who was the SSPX investigator, admitting that these things happened, that it was actually a terrible thing, that Schmidberger and Fillet did this. I mean, it's incontrovertible evidence, but it's amazing how when you produce this evidence, they just write it off like, oh, Church Militant said it. They were, I can't believe it. Like, okay, you don't have to believe what I say, but look at the documents. Listen to the tapes. I've put it right there for you.
How could you guys even still be doing what you're doing if what you were telling couldn't be totally corroborated? I mean, you'd be sued out of business like that.
Completely sued. Right now we are being sued for defamation by a New Hampshire priest because he was unhappy with a negative report that we put out. But we stand by every word. We're fighting it, and I believe that we're going to win this case. But we know what it's like to be sued for defamation, and I wouldn't put a single word out there that I thought wasn't 110% true. So I think there's just a great deal of blindness and resistance to wanting to read any of this. I can't tell you the number of times people just mindlessly attack me. And then I ask them, well, did you watch the report? Did you read this? Did you see this? And they're like, no, I didn't bother. I'm like, oh. It's like, how do you argue with people like that? You don't even want to look at the evidence.
Right. They're wishful thinkers. So they're going to think what they want to, they're going to see what they want to see and not what they don't want to see.
Right.
Right. So I'm curious, what are some things you've learned from your work with abuse victims, or things that, like maybe could help our viewers, or people anywhere out there who's going to deal with these people themselves, or, have to help them in any way, like, so that we can do our duty by them and really be kind?
Sure. I think one is I've developed a lot more compassion for victims. I mean, I had a lot of compassion anyway, but working personally with various victims, understanding their circumstances, and some of them who left the faith, I'm not nearly as judgmental towards them as I used to be. Because I think, wow, if I went through what they went through and the trauma that they went through, and then being re-victimized by people in the hierarchy who didn't believe me, it would be so hard for me. I can understand. I'm not saying it's right. I'm just saying that understandably from a human perspective, why they would be weak and decide, I just can't do this anymore. I can't remain a Catholic anymore because I was betrayed by too many people in the church that I trusted. So I certainly do not look down on any of them. I pray for them that they would come back to the faith, because it's really in the church through the life-giving sacraments they can truly find healing and resolution. So developing that compassion, and then also learning to work with lots of different kinds of people, because my work takes me to very interesting places and with very interesting people. And it puts me in touch with people that I would never be in touch with at all. Like, for instance, work that I did exposing Cardinal Dolan. There was a cover-up involving Father Peter McQuelly, who's since passed on, unfortunately, who was, you can't make this stuff up. The guy was involved in a gay for pay prostitute scheme for years, and Cardinal Dolan knew about it. And the brave source willing to testify to all this was actually the former girlfriend of the gay for pay prostitute who was a stripper in New York, Jewish atheist stripper. And yet here she was, the only one who was willing to talk about all of this. Everything that she has told me is completely 100% true, checks out. She has done stellar work. She's allowed me to use her name. Her name's Tatiana, but she's done just stellar work behind the scenes, working with law enforcement and various individuals, and then talking to me, exposing some of this stuff. And so I'm still friends with her today. I pray for her. I pray for her conversion. But I've actually sent her a Blessed Rosary and a St. Benedict medal, which she keeps, in a beautiful box next to her bed. So she keeps it. And so you can pray for everybody watching, pray for Tatiana. But it's interesting, I work with so many different people, but in my opinion, they're people of goodwill who really are desiring truth. And they're looking for truth, and they recognize that at Church Militant, that's our desire as well. So they're willing to work with us, even though politically they may be completely different from us. Yes. But they know we have the same goal of we desire truth and we desire justice and exposing this evil. Because I think any person of goodwill can see, this is evil. Doesn't matter if you're politically left or whatever. You can see, look, what's going on in the church with this stuff it's evil and it's got to be exposed.
Absolutely. No, it's great. Have you learned more things just in general about like what happens to abuse victims later in life? Or, sometimes people will say, especially if they're very eager to justify somebody, they're like, well, he made a mistake once, maybe he abused one child, but there's confession and they can heal. And but does that really happen? I mean, how likely is that? What kind of plays out in that world?
Yeah, I mean, each victim is different and the levels of abuse are different for each person, and each person handles it differently. There's some who stay in the church and choose to fight, others who also stay in the church but want to lead just a quiet life and forget all about it. And then, of course, a number of people who end up leaving the church. So the trauma affects each victim differently, and people just really need to be careful about the way, need to be respectful about the way that you approach these victims or alleged victims, because sometimes there's not enough proof. But I've seen so many callous comments on social media from individuals just writing them off, dismissing them. And you don't understand how much damage that does to someone who was actually abused, especially because I don't really deal with investigations until I get independent corroboration that yes, there is proof that this person was abused, either through maybe a police report or a court document or their own admission or anything like that. And yet the way that these victims can be treated by anonymous individuals or SSPX loyalists, or not just SSPX, anyone, trad loyalists or anyone else, writing them off, it can be incredibly damaging and hurtful and devastating and re-victimizing the individual all over again. So people need to just really watch what they say. Be careful what you say. Say nothing. If anything, and you have doubts, just don't say anything. But yeah, if anything, I've learned not to idealize the traditional community, because there was a sense in which I once kind of idealized it, right? That's how a lot of people approach the TLM. They kind of idealize it, and there's oh, this is the best, and it's so holy, and this is where I can come and be safe from everything. And I hate to say it, that's just not necessarily true. Maybe you are part of a really great traditional community. That's wonderful. There's some good ones out there. Don't idealize it though, and don't idolize the traditional Latin Mass. I see that a lot too. And people saying, like, for instance, there was a talk that was given by a priest who offers the TLM. And part of the title of the talk was How the TLM Guarantees Personal Sanctity. And I thought, wow, really? Guarantees?
Well, we all should have been saints before the council.
Yes.
Whoa. Wow.
I'm like, what about the fact that a large share of sex abuse took place before Vatican II? I mean, if the TLM guaranteed personal sanctity, then we wouldn't have had all these incidents of sex abuse and cover up. And yet a large share of it took place before Vatican II. I mean, people need to stop selling this idea that if we just implement the TLM, all the problems in the church will be fixed and saved. They will not. They weren't fixed and saved back then. It's not going to happen now. What needs to happen is a complete change of heart in each individual going to the TLM. And I don't care if you go to the Novus Ordo or the TLM. I've met very holy people in the Novus Ordo, very holy priests, some of the holiest priests I know, offering the Novus Ordo. So it frustrates me so much when people make this dichotomy and exalt this as, oh, this is the ideal. And if you go to this, you're guaranteed personal holiness. And if you go to this, you're just not. It's like, I'm sorry. In my experience, that is absolutely just, it's not that black and white at all.
Right. Well, and I understand that a lot of the victims, when they come forward at first, they usually are telling their family, and some of their families completely disown them or their entire church community. I mean, that's not something that you do to get good points with anybody. It's like only if you're desperate. And what do they even say? There's like the general statistics out there, like in child cases, are that 95% of children are not lying if they report a sexual abuse instance, because like especially for a kid, like, are they even going to think of that on their own? Like, how would they come up with that? Why would they want to talk about it? Why would they want to make a big deal out of it and then have to suffer all the consequences? I mean, it's terrible. So
It really is.
really suffer. And then I also, I mean, maybe you can speak to this too, but many victims end up becoming abusers themselves, especially if they were abused as children and then into adulthood. So it creates this whole culture that just goes around and around. It actually gets worse and worse as time goes by.
It's a vicious cycle. And with the wider church, they sort of faced their day of reckoning back in 2002, back when the Boston Globe spotlight first, broke the news about the sex abuse and cover-up going on in Boston under cardinal law, and that made national headlines. That was back in 2002, and that's what spurred the U.S. bishops to create the Dallas Charter for the protection of minors. And that was supposed to have fixed the clergy abuse problem in the church in America. Now, of course, we know that McCarrick was a drafter of the Dallas Charter, who was probably America's most notorious clerical predator, and it certainly didn't fix the problem, obviously. But back in 2002, that was kind of the day of reckoning for the wider church in America. And since that time, Catholics in general have come to understand that, yeah, there's a sex abuse problem in the church. And so back then in the 80s and 90s, before this happened, when abuse victims would talk about it, they were, as you mentioned, a lot of them were ostracized. A lot of them were not believed. Like, oh, no, this couldn't happen in the U.S. church. No, couldn't happen in the church. Now, in the wider church, people are more believed. However, that day of reckoning is still taking place. It's only recently taking place in trad communities like the SSPX and now the FSSP with Father Jackson. That's been recent in the past couple of years. Mm-hmm. They're now facing their own day of reckoning. And I've worked with so many victims who were absolutely shamed, shunned by their community, and particularly the SSPX, when they talked about abuse. When they, for instance, Father Benedict Vanderputten, who is now no longer an SSPX priest, but he abused a number of young women. And I spoke to a number of those women. And in every single case, they were shunned. In every single case, the community ostracized them or their family. They didn't want to believe that an SSPX priest could be guilty of such crimes. And it's not just them. I mean, it's this case after case after case that I've spoken to from people all over the world. Every time a victim speaks out in the SSPX, they are shunned. They don't want to believe them. And so unfortunately, that's still happening a lot in the trad communities. It's not happening so much in the Novus Ordo because, like I said, they've had, more than 2 decades now to process this, but they're still processing it now in the trad communities, and they're still learning to come to terms with it. And what's really interesting is when I first aired my expose on the SSPX in April 2020, that got massive backlash and nobody wanted to believe it. They were all attacking me as a liar and the victims and whistleblowers as liars. But I just kept doing, I kept rolling out these reports, rolling out these investigations, one after another, until the body of evidence is just so big now that nobody can deny unless you're willfully blind. And I've seen a slow progression in people's thinking about SSPX abuse. In the beginning, it was absolute flat out denial. No, it doesn't happen. You're lying. Then after a while, it's like, okay, well, maybe it happens, but they're just tiny little pockets here. It's nothing. It's just 1 or 2. But then as more reports come out now, I'm noticing more and more either people are silent, they won't say anything about it, or they'll say like, okay, fine, it happens everywhere. Like that's the attitude I'm getting now, is more like, okay, fine, it happens everywhere.
Okay. Well, so at least they're to the point of admitting that they're not immune to it, but still, it's a little bit denial still. Interesting.
Still, very much. Very much.
So abusers,
they still hate me.
No. Well, we don't hate you. So abusers, like, I just want to ask this real quick because I think this is interesting. When they have like a year of penance or whatever, and then they put them back in ministry. I mean, what is the mentality there? Like, is that like clinically proven to, sort of fix somebody, and then they're not a threat anymore, or they're not likely to fall into it? I mean, how likely is an abuser to continue abusing until they're just removed from the occasion of sin, basically?
Well, what's interesting is what Bishop Fillet did for 24 years with putting a predator in some remote place for a year or two of so-called prayer and penance before reinstating him to ministry is exactly what the U.S. bishops were doing for decades before it all exploded in 2002. That's exactly what they were doing for decades, like sending them off to rehab, right? St. Luke's, and then thinking they can be cured after 6 months or a year or 2 years, whatever, and then putting them back in ministry. And then they abuse again, so they send them off again. It's exactly what they did. And since that time, the U.S. bishops have been called out for it, and they don't do that anymore, as far as I know, not too much. Some of them are still doing it, but for the most part, they realize we took the wrong approach back then, because the rate of recidivism with pedophiles is extremely high, extraordinarily high. You could send them away to prison for years and they come back, and a lot of them will reoffend. We understand that now. And so now there's more of a zero tolerance policy. At least there should be, but there's the recognition. There is not that same recognition in the SSPX. And there should be, because Fillet has the benefit of how many decades of abuse in the church. And then he knows what they did, and he knows what the U.S. bishops did and the bishops around the world did. He knows that. Right. But again, it's this clericalist attitude of I've got to protect my priests and I have to shield the SSPX from scandal. And so therefore, I'm going to treat this very quietly, send them away quietly. Nobody's going to know why, because he would never explain why. Sometimes he would make up reasons. Like, for instance, with Father Pierre Duverger. He was caught in a sex scandal in Bordeaux, France, and immediately taken out in the middle of the school year, which is very strange. In the middle of the school year, taken out, sent to a monastery in New Mexico. And the reason that Fillet said was, he had a heart problem, had heart condition he had to deal with. Never told anybody about the sexual scandal. And then what does Duverger do in America? He abuses other women.
Oh, gosh.
Yeah.
Wow. It just goes on and on. Man. Mm-hmm. Well, I really appreciate you answering all my questions. And I don't want to keep you too long. There are some questions in the chat. I don't know if you want to look at those real quick before you go.
Sure, let's see.
Okay.
I don't think I see anything on the screen. Oh, there you go.
This was the first one we got. My question for the end, has Christine ever been able to get a look at how the SSPX uses their money that donors and parishioners give to them? Ever been obstructed? They get millions. God bless.
That is a very good question. The SSPX is very wealthy. They have wealthy benefactors, wealthy donors. How they use their money, they have used their money to defend priests who were accused of abuse. They use their lawyers, SSPX lawyers. For instance, in the case of Father Christophe Juanel in France, he was convicted in 2017 and sentenced to 19 years in prison for raping and torturing 3 female priests. Convicted. People always come to me like, where are the court decrees? Where's the proof? I'm like, here's proof. And this wasn't decades and decades ago. This just happened a few years ago. Father Juanel, SSPX priest, sadistic. I don't even want to describe what he did, how he tortured the women, because it's too graphic. Sick, twisted individual. But the SSPX used loads of their money to hire a lawyer to defend Father Juanel in court. They do that with many, many cases of these predators who end up in court. They a case that just happened right now, just a few months ago, Father Matthew Staffkey. He just pled guilty to molesting his 9-year-old niece over the course of 3 years. And when I sent a query to Father John Fullerton, who is the district superior here in the U.S., I asked him a number of questions before he pled guilty. And when the trial was going on, not the trial, but the legal proceedings were going on, I asked Father Fullerton, okay, did you have a knowledge of previous allegations against Father Staffkey? Because you sent him on leave for a few years. And when you sent him on leave, he went back home and then he abused his niece. Why did you send him on leave? Was it because of abuse allegations? Now that he's been charged criminally and he's got to face these legal proceedings, are you paying for an attorney for him? Are you using money for that?
Yeah.
He never answered a single one of my questions, never answered. So that's transparency for you. As far as I'm concerned, if you don't answer my questions, I don't want to say you're guilty. But if you have a track record of using SSPX money from donors to hire lawyers to protect these predators, then you're doing it in this case. Unless you tell me otherwise, you have a track record of doing it, you're doing it in this case, and you refuse to answer my questions. So, so that's one way that the SSPX is using money, donor money, is to help defend predators who then end up convicted. I just showed you two examples right there. I have, we published an article from a former SSPX donor who gave many thousands of dollars to the SSPX and then decided I'm no longer doing this because he was absolutely shocked by the staff key case and all the other abuse cases and the fact that leadership isn't doing enough to remedy it. They seem like they pretend that they are. They claim that they are. For instance, setting up an independent review board, which is not at all independent. But so, yeah, I think people should be questioning, where's my money going? And are you using any of my money to defend predators? And the answer is yes, they are. Right. And people shouldn't be happy about that.
Right. That's a really good point. Absolutely. Yeah. The next one we have is, does Christine get more thank mail than hate mail? I'd hope that in this line of work, the positive feedback would overshadow the negative.
That's a good question. I guess it depends on which crowd you're talking about. I do not get more thank mail from the trad crowd. I get more hate mail from the trad crowd. I get thank mail from victims, definitely. And I get thank mail from people in the wider church who are not necessarily part of the trad community, but they're in the wider church. They understand, look, we need to get rid of this filth. Now, to their credit, there have been a few SSPXers who have written me and thanked me. They've said, I hate that there's this evil and this filth in the SSPX. I do want to see it purged out of the ranks of the SSPX because I love the society and I want it. So to their credit, they have some integrity and they're willing to see that we have the same goals here. Purge the evil from its ranks. So yeah, I have gotten a few of those. And I should also say that it was an SSPX priest who actually helped me with some of my investigations. So I've got to thank him as well. He's no longer part of the SSPX. He quit precisely because he was disgusted with the way that they dealt with abuse and cover up. So he's no longer with them. But he helped me in quite a number of investigations. So I don't want people out there to think that I'm painting this broad brush and that I think everyone in the SSPX is totally wicked and that I hate them. I don't hate them. I want to see them purified of this evil.
Right.
And you should too. If you're an SSPX loyalist and you truly love the SSPX, or if you're a traditionalist at all and you truly love traditionalism, you should desire that it be this evil be purged from the ranks of traditionalism anywhere that it's found. And instead of being angry at me for doing it and accusing me of having an axe to grind or being biased or hateful, I mean, I'm trying to do a favor here, So yeah,
somebody's got to lance the boil or whatever. I mean, it's not fun, but man, there's one more. Here, let's see. Can you comment on the results of the KBI investigation into abuse in the state of Kansas? Do you know if any SSPX priests were named?
My last sort of interaction with the KBI was, I think it was a couple months ago, and I just asked them what the progress was on the SSPX investigation. They said that it's still ongoing. Now, my understanding is they're supposed to be producing a report soon. I don't know when, but if anybody's ever worked with law enforcement, they never talk about ongoing investigations. They can't. They're not allowed to. So they're not going to tell you. They're not going to name names. They're not going to say, "Oh yeah, we're looking at this priest or that." They're just not allowed, especially when they're dealing with media. They're not allowed to speak. And so the last conversation I had was they were just simply saying this. It's an ongoing investigation. Now I will say this: I don't have high hopes because an individual who is good friends with the attorney general, right, who is leading the investigation, spearheading the investigation. One of the politicians who is actually very good friends with the attorney general is SSPX. He's part of the SSPX community, as far as I know. I think he's part of the St. Mary's community, maybe. And so I've had people contact me with concerns that they may not go as hard against the SSPX as some hope, simply because there are political ties and connections behind the scenes there. So,
Right. Yeah, I've heard there's a lot of that kind of fraternizing in Kansas. It's really the hotbed because the law enforcement has so many people in it that are loyal to the SSPX and things. So it's like we don't even know how high up that goes, but they're doing a good job so far of kind of capping off some of the stuff from getting out or getting really dealt with.
Exactly. So I don't know. I mean, it might be very disappointing. It might be a very disappointing report that we get. So, yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Christine, for your time. I really appreciate everything that you said and shared. And I want everybody to, know about Church Militant and, support them if you can. And just, now we have a little more understanding of what you guys are doing and why it's important, and, that we can really all help each other in this fight. And so thank you so much, Christine. We just really appreciate you. We want you to know, keep up the good work, and we're cheering for you.
Thank you. And I would also encourage your viewers, if you have any tips, if you're a whistleblower, if you're a victim, if you're law enforcement, if you have any tips for me at all about abuse or cover up that you'd like me to expose, you can write me at actionarm@churchmilitant.com. That's actionarm, no space. It's just all together, actionarm@churchmilitant.com. And I will do my best to follow up. But for those who want to kind of watch more of my investigations, all you have to do is go to churchmilitant.com. There's a tab that just says investigations. If you click on it, you can watch all of them there or read the articles there. But thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Oh, absolutely. Well, thank you. And I do have some links in the description below, so people can just click them and go see some of your work. And so we'll close, and maybe we'll have you on again sometime, Christine. It's been great.
That.
Thank you. All right. God bless.
God bless.